For more stories like these, go to www.social-tv.co.za, subscribe to us on YouTube, and follow us on our social mediums.
According to UNESCO, over 1.5 billion learners in 165 countries have been affected by the COVID-19 school closures. Now that's prompted organizations to launch this global education coalition that supports countries in scaling up their distance learning practices. Recently, Robert Speed, Vice President for Middle East Africa at a company called Blackboard, wrote an insightful piece on how to prepare students for a competitive, globalized world with savvy education technology. We have a chat to him about his insights, his thought leadership piece on this edition of our social newscast, brought to you by www.social-tv.co.za. Robert, thank you very much for your time. This is a black swan moment. Everybody is trying to find in which direction to go. Talk to me about how do we prepare students to be more competitive, especially as the world seems to kind of hunker down and deal with an unknown.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Sam. I think pre-COVID, the online education was almost a nice to have. And a lot of the institutions around South Africa that we work with, we have 20 customers, they were using online learning with students as part of the academic day, but it was only a very small part of the academic day. And then obviously through COVID, they realized that shifting online would be part of their business continuity almost. So getting everybody prepared, I think in South Africa has been a step-by-step process. There's a lot of teacher training that's been going on, and that still continues, Sam, to be the key element of going online, so teachers can really, deliver the right content in the right way to students that are not in the classroom face to face. And I would say that this focus is something that we've seen drastically become more of a requirement. But having said that, students are very savvy, as we know. They have all their devices. They're online every day. So I think from the student's perspective, it's just about the control of delivering an online classroom environment so that they can still be successful as part of the curriculum, in all honesty.
And you've almost hit the nail on the head for me, Robert, because in many instances, we've heard of this kind of sink and swim mentality. Overnight, teachers that have been teaching for years have had to learn how to teach remotely. Some do it incredibly well, some do it really poorly. How do we get everybody? I mean, and you're right, kids are very tech savvy. They adapt very quickly. In some instances, they're even ahead of their teachers. But how do we get the educators, the institutions that have been brick and mortar businesses for years to also now shift?
Yes, this is part of what we've seen. I'm actually impressed with the institutions in South Africa and also the schools. I think, they've handled the challenge extremely well. They've had a roadmap that has enabled them to have an infrastructure, but that infrastructure needs to scale further so that they can accommodate. But having, the ability to train teachers, I would always come back to that, and improving how they understand about delivering the content online is really the key so that students are more engaged. And part of that is through professional development. I'd say that a lot of focus now from institutions in South Africa is on guiding and counseling their teachers so that they can close that gap with the students. And there are simple things that can be done, through training around, developing specific interactive content based on the curriculum that's in place within these institutions. And also training of teachers to be more aware of how, the different platforms work, because there are so many platforms that they have access to today, and how they can calibrate and use them to make the lessons more engaging. And this is a key area, and I agree with you. It's sink or swim, But I would say that a lot of institutions are very well ahead of that curve. It's just the scale of teaching and learning that needs to be conducted in such a short period of time now. This is the challenge that we see.
Obviously, as a leader in the space, you are very much aware that UNESCO has launched this Global Education Coalition support platform. And it really is about developing and scaling up learning practices. With somebody who's got a global view, how are we doing in terms of the uniformity around the learning practices and applying them in different spaces? Have you seen that some countries adapt better to it than others?
Very much so, Sam. And it's a great point because, as we know from UNESCO, there are over 1.5 billion learners now in 165 countries that have been affected by COVID-19. What we're seeing from a global perspective is that the infrastructure is probably the most critical element. And as I highlighted before, I was impressed with South Africa because there have been some investments already made that enabled a lot of students to be online as part of the academic day. But there are challenges even in North America, even in Europe, even in the Middle East, in really coordinating a plan for the institution to be able to have that outreach. So the standards do, vary, but South Africa is very high on the list of countries that have the access, have the infrastructure, have the capabilities, have these very clever teachers that can adapt. So I wouldn't say that South Africa was struggling. I would just say it's a coordinated plan within each institution that really needs to upscale in order to cater for the challenges that we've seen in the last 5 months now.
I was super fascinated by your thought leadership piece, where you talked about preparing students for a competitive, globalized world with savvy education technology. But there was one word that kind of bounced out at me in your thought leadership article was internationalized access to learning materials. That's a big concept. What does that mean, Robin?
Well, Sam, this really means, there are so many publishers, there are so many content providers out there in the world today that are really easy to access online. The way that the technology and software is built around the world in different companies that are providing this, it means it's very adaptable. And if you're using a specific learning management system, you should be able to get access to a whole breadth of content. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's paid for. But what I would highlight here really is that an internationalization means that standards can be raised. Access to that information and content is so freely available that everybody should be benefiting. And this is something I was thinking through personally after reflecting over the last 4 months. And I was really impressed about how institutions have adopted, different content from around the world that can help in a specific curriculum, close the gap between the teachers and the students, making things more interesting. And really, this is what we've seen in this transition to teaching and learning online, Sam, is that now the content is just so freely available, and it really can help in, upskilling and changing the direction of students' learning.
There was a time, I don't know if you can remember this, but there was a time when online learning was scoffed at, where people looked at online learning as it would never have a role to play in education. And according to your thought leadership piece, by 2025, it'll be worth about $350 billion US. It obviously means that with that market share, that technology is getting better, the offering is becoming more sophisticated. But how do we make sure that we future-proof this opportunity? And by the way, it's also an opportunity for job creation.
Indeed, it is, Sam. And I'm glad you've highlighted on this because I think it's the adoption. And the adoption from the decision makers within these institutions is really what I'm impressed with. I would say that Blackboard, for example, 20-year company in online learning. So, I agree that it's been scoffed at for many, many years, but finally it's come to a proving point with this rapid decision that was taken in many, many countries about, physical campuses closing and students having to go online. Yes, the market is growing. Education technology is growing. You've just highlighted some very interesting numbers. I would say that the value here really is on how quickly the adoption of various learning programs can be onboarded. So there is a future-proof concept, and I would say that the way that we see the education market developing is that more content is available, more training is available, students' access becomes easier. Obviously, we need to think clearly around the infrastructure, because that's one of the barriers, of course, in different countries to get access to all of these wonderful platforms and content. But it's very much a rapid changing environment, Sam, and we're seeing, year-on-year growth. We're seeing year-on-year changes. The way that the applications are being built by various education companies are coming to market a lot quicker, and that's having a positive impact.